Good morning. Hi,
Good
Jessica. How are you
morning.
today?
Doing well. How are you, Tom?
Good, thanks. So, good morning, everybody who's joining us this morning. My name is Tom Simcoe. I'm a partner in Bond, Schoeneck King's tax-exempt org practice group. Today, I'm speaking with Jessica Copeland, who is co-chair of our cybersecurity and data privacy practice. We're here today to talk to you about a recent security breach had by Blackbaud, which is a major cloud software provider for nonprofits, which most of you are probably familiar with, which was recently reported in the media. I would like to just read a little bit about that report, and then I've got some questions for you, Jessica, that probably some of our folks out there listening may also share with me, which hopefully will give us some insight into what this breach was about and what it means, and maybe what we should be thinking about doing to protect ourselves from future breaches and other matters. So I've got an article here from the Nonprofit Times, which provides some pretty good background. So Blackbaud, one of the world's largest providers of financial and fundraising technology to nonprofits, was hacked and paid a ransom to have hijacked data destroyed by cybercriminals. Officials learned of the intrusion in May and called in law enforcement and independent forensic experts to work with Blackbaud's own security team. Teams were able to prevent the blocking of system access for users and the fully encrypting of files. So the cyber criminals were able to remove a copy of a subset of data from Blackbaud's self-hosted environment. Credit card information, bank account information, social security numbers were not stolen, according to the spokesperson. Officials said they have confirmation that the stolen data was destroyed after the ransom was paid. So I got a bunch of questions just on what I've read so far. So if I can,
There's a lot there.
in. Yeah, there's a ton. So the first thing that strikes me is officials learned of the intrusion in May. So this article, which is a couple weeks old, this came out in July. So what happened for the 2 months in between, and why did they wait so long? And is that right? Can you explain some of that to us?
So it seems to be a delay in reporting. Certain cybersecurity or data privacy laws actually require notice to be provided within 72 hours, in particular the GDPR, which affects EU residents. Within the United States, there are some states or territories that require notification within 10 days time, or immediately, as quickly as you can notify individuals. And in no defense to Blackbaud, I do not have any insight into the investigation or whether or not there actually was a reasonable delay or an excusable delay. But the practical sense is when you're dealing with a massive data breach affecting, this is a cloud service provider, so they are a provider of service to thousands of customers, potentially tens of thousands of customers. And within each customer, there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of affected individuals, potentially, right? So in order to drill down to determine, at least at the customer level, which customers were impacted would take a long time. And then also having the forensic investigation into, did this intrusion stop? Have we halted the criminals from getting any further access to our systems? That takes a long time. Once the FBI or police are involved, that could create some other delay. So there may have been delay beyond what should be expected in terms of turning around in 72 hours. But the practical side of things is, in order to notify affected customers, you have to know which customers were affected. And then you have to know the extent of what you're notifying them of, because you can't just say we were breached. That opens up a can of worms that's unnecessary. You want to be as informative as possible with your notification, whether it's to customers or constituents or affected individuals. And so in order to do that, you need to drill down deep into the actual breach and determine what you're notifying and who you're notifying.
Now, the article mentions that they were able to confirm that the data that was stolen, whatever it was destroyed. How trustworthy or confident can we be that that was the case?
I think it leaves a lot of questioning. I don't know that you can 100% believe that they have enough confirmation. I mean, the confirmation they're referring to is from cyber criminals. So,
right.
Sure, pay us ransom and we'll delete the data. I don't know how confident any organization can actually be with that type of criminal advancing that message, but it's all they have to work
Mhm.
from.
Mhm.
And the sense of a cyber criminal using ransomware, they really are trying to just extract as much money as they can, and then they don't necessarily want the data. They want to
Mhm.
hold the data hostage until they receive payment and then potentially delete it. And that's allegedly what happened here. But unless have a criminal on the witness stand and cross-examining them to determine whether they told the truth, I don't really know how confident you can be in that.
Right, right, right.
Um,
And
and
can
then the
even trust them
other,
if they do. Yeah.
well, correct. And then the other point that I read in a few publications about this breach is that they're monitoring the dark web, which,
Mhm.
I mean, that's good that they're doing that. But again, I don't know that that's really going to confirm or not that the data was deleted, because how long are they going to continue that? I mean, we have instances of a data breach where a cyber intruder was sitting just quiet on a system for over a year until they
Right.
reached a point where they could take advantage of a vulnerability. So
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
really no guarantee. And
Mhm.
the best thing that you can do after any breach that affects your data is to just be more diligent with monitoring your credit and monitoring your reputation, monitoring your bank accounts. And the benefit that we have here with this breach is that it does sound like any what would be considered private information under the New York Shield Act, so social security numbers or driver's license numbers, was not accessible because it was encrypted. So the benefit here, if there is one, is that there shouldn't be any negative impact or risk to the financial state of any of the affected individuals.
Right, right. So it sounds like the data that was encrypted, which was a lot of what we would normally worry about uh, as private persons, no matter who we are, yeah, social security number, et cetera, that might lead to data or ID theft or something like that, wasn't necessarily exposed, but other kinds of information which could nonetheless be quite sensitive, um, like with respect to major donors regarding their giving history, information about their family members, the types of things that development officers usually maintain in the files so that they can, develop a rapport and have relationships and think about, for large giving campaigns and things like that. That kind of information would not have been encrypted, and could be available for people that, could find ways to use it, and otherwise just be embarrassing for the institutions if it was disclosed.
Sure. Well, and I don't know that you can necessarily say it would be embarrassing for the institutions. I think that, one thing to keep in mind is that relying on Blackbaud as a vendor, they promote themselves as the gold standard for this type of solution for nonprofits and educational institutions. And so there shouldn't necessarily be a feeling of embarrassment. These things do happen to the best and organization, to the tightest run security plan and program. This happens. I
Mm-hmm.
think the best step to take if you're an impacted customer is to drill down into the exact data that was unencrypted in those files, find out where those individuals reside, and first determine, do you have a legal obligation to notify? And typically within the US, based on what we've seen in the press about what type of unencrypted data might have been exposed, there's likely not a legal obligation. There are a few states to note that require notification if, say, a date of birth and name is hacked. Most states do not include date of birth on the list of private information or personal information, but Washington State and North Dakota do, so that's something to keep in mind. The other piece of it is if you have affected individuals outside of the US, you might have a greater likelihood of legal obligation to notify EU residents under the GDPR, or potentially Canadian residents. Although based on my understanding of Canadian privacy law and breach notification requirements there versus the GDPR, you're more likely to have obligations under the GDPR.
Oh, great, great. Good to know. Yes, I think there's two, I guess, some practical questions that flow from that, but maybe one more sort of contextual question that will be helpful. Just to understand, there's this reference to data having been maintained in a legacy environment. What does that mean when you have
So
that type of breach?
So typically, many organizations rely on legacy systems as backup storage or a location for certain data storage. And there's benefit to that for organizations because typically it's quite expensive to migrate data that's residing on a legacy system. The motivation to migrate it is that the legacy systems have potentially more vulnerability to intrusion because either firewalls haven't been updated, certain security levels that would be able to be applied on newer systems. They just don't have the capability to pair that with a legacy system. So, and when we're talking about the cost of it, I mean, it can be tens of thousands of dollars to migrate the data, depending on how much data it is. And so quite often organizations make the decision, well, for the backup data, hopefully you do a cleanse of your system to encrypt data that is on the backup, which would help mitigate risk. But it would be more cost effective to leave backup data in a legacy system and then use a newer system for new data coming in and data that you're accessing on a live real-time basis.
Does that typically mean it's not hosted in the cloud in that kind of situation, that it's on servers?
It could be on older servers. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I guess it sounds like it's still fairly common to have data stored on legacy systems, that they're also likely to be a target for hackers because they're not as current, and they don't have as strong or robust of security features as cloud-based systems. Is that something that folks should be thinking about, particularly in light of situations like this where there's ransomware? You could save money, or maybe it's quite expensive to transition the data. But on the other hand, if you get hacked and you have to pay a ransom and live with the fact that the data is out there somewhere, maybe the economics of that start to look a little bit different.
Exactly. I think what I've seen in the industry trends is, 5-10 years ago, when an IT department or director of technology or CIO would go to a board and say, we need X amounts of money to ensure that our cybersecurity plan is robust and we are protecting all data because it is such a value to our organization. Mm-hmm. That conversation was a lot harder than it is now because there were not as many reported breaches, and frankly, organizations weren't as heavy into data as they are now, and storing data either in a cloud service provider or segregating data in certain networks and having protocols in place for each of those networks. So the conversation has changed. I hope that it continues to, but there's always going to be resistance because the budget for a robust cybersecurity plan could blow the budget for many other initiatives of the organization. And, depending on what the focus of the organization is, you just might not be able to build it in for the next couple of years. Again, you're right. You have to do a risk-based analysis and what is the potential that we could be harmed. Now, an organization like Blackbaud that stores pretty significant donor and giving history information should be more cognizant of what potential cost a breach like this would have. And I would imagine they're going to learn quickly that it may have been a better decision to build in budget for migrating data than what the fallout of this breach will be.
Now, as a user of Blackbaud, is it at all transparent to me whether my data is being stored in a legacy system or in the cloud?
As the affected individuals to an organization that relies on Blackbaud, or the customer to Blackbaud?
As I'm a higher ed institution and I've got a contract with Blackbaud. Do I have any clue what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, it's possible that you do not. It might be spelled out in the contract, but probably not. It would require a conversation to have a better understanding. And it should be a conversation that takes place. The reality is, at the pace that we run as businesses in the US, you probably don't take the time to say, which data is going to be in a backup, which data is going to be accessible to me. But you're right in that, it's always easy as the Monday morning quarterback to look back and say, oh, I wish I would have known that I had all this data in a backup, but it's probably not the way of the relationship as it begins.
Okay. So I guess that comes to the practical question. So I wake up one morning, I'm the chief information officer of a nonprofit, and I get, I guess, that dreaded email that, or from people saying, hey, we're locked out of the system, or however, it unfolds. And I find out, oh, we've been hacked. We have a problem. What do I do first? What do I need? What is my top item for response?
Well, hopefully your organization has an incident response plan, and if you don't, you should. And that incident response plan will provide exactly what you're asking for. What is the first step? So contact, if it's an individual that is not in IT that recognizes this issue, call the director of IT, the CIO, as you mentioned in your scenario. But also make sure that you have separated the impacted system from the larger network so that the intrusion can't continue. And then you want to make sure you contact your insurance carrier, you should contact your attorney, and you should contact a forensic company to come in and determine where the intrusion occurred and whether it's been stopped and what, if any, data was accessed or acquired. And those terms are significant in the land of how do I determine if I need to notify individuals? That's born out of whether there was data accessed, viewed, manipulated in any way, or acquired, meaning downloaded, copied, or taken.
Okay, and so that's my internal management plan. Let's say then that let's say I got an email from Blackbaud or somebody else saying that they've been hacked, so I don't have control over those steps. What should I do in that case?
So it's a similar response, although the additional layer of pull the contract that you have with whomever that vendor was, determine if you have any rights to access their forensic report or investigation. Even though it's not on your system, it's definitely worth trying to receive access, because if you need to notify individuals, you should be equipped with the right information to say this is exactly what happened. It might not be practical. It's something to keep in mind in future negotiations with vendors, to try to put some clauses into the contract that allow for you to have access to any data breach investigation that occurs on the vendor side. But beyond that, you should notify insurance carrier again, because your cyber insurance may be robust enough to cover a breach on a vendor side. Notify your attorney. And I say that most significantly when there's a breach, because communications with counsel, if it's kept within a closed network, so just attorney and the client, are likely to be protected. It's not foolproof, but it's the best chance you'll have at protecting the investigation. That's a story for another day, but that's why it's so important to get an attorney involved at the outset. And then also start looking into, what did I rely on this vendor for? They're telling me these files were impacted. What data is stored in these files? What is my risk exposure? And that will help you determine whether you need to rely on your insurance coverage or whether it's minimal. And so it's better not to have to pay the deductible, which could range from $1,000 to $50,000, depending on the policy you have.
Is it typically a matter of contract or baseline cybersecurity data privacy law? If I have a vendor that's been subject to a breach, do I have a right to itemization of every individual whose data was covered within that breach?
Not under data privacy law. So as a processor, they're typically only required, at least with respect to data privacy laws, to report the breach to the owner, so the controller or the original organization that held the data. But if you have a term in the contract that requires more, then you might have a right to seek more information. But again, that comes back to why your contract language is so important. And it's not easy to get that language into a contract. it depends on the position of each party, like any other contract negotiation.
Jessica, one last question before we wrap up. So let's assume I don't have any legal obligation to notify my donors in this case, or someone else whose data I have in my files. Even if I don't have a legal requirement to do so, what considerations should I have in mind as to whether to make the decision to reveal the breach has occurred?
So this is an analysis that occurs in any breach, to be honest. It's not just this massive Blackbaud breach that many organizations are grappling with. But the practical approach of should you notify has to be a institutional based decision, and at least with respect to the Blackbaud breach, because it's become such a publicized breach, and the information that may have been accessed, I will not say it was accessed, may have been accessed, doesn't include personal information triggering notification, at least mostly within the US. The idea of donor relations or alumni relations is so important to many organizations. Many nonprofits, as you know, rely on their donor base, especially in the environment we're in now, where you're not likely to get as much grant funding. It's really important to show your donor base, and for educational institutions, your alumni base, that you're caring for them, caring for their data, and that there was really nothing that you could have done better to protect the data, and that you will continue to be responsible in the future to maintain their data in the best way possible with implementing the appropriate cybersecurity practices. Because most likely, donors to these organizations are going to receive notification, or they're going to read about it in publications that they read regularly. And so,
I might be wondering, was I covered in this or not? Will somebody please tell me what's going on? Yeah.
And then you don't want to be the organization that doesn't notify, because it's going to raise more questions about, oh, well, what information did XYZ organization have that ABC organization didn't have? And so I was notified by ABC organization, but not XYZ, and I might not know exactly the extent of the exposure that I've suffered.
Right. Yeah, there's a need for transparency here, as with all things, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for providing your time today. This has been really informative, and I would certainly recommend anyone that's listening, feel free to contact us if you have any questions about this or any other cybersecurity or exempt organization matters. Thanks very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care.